Hey everyone, welcome back to Here in Apologetics. Super pumped you're joining us today. Today I have David Graieg. I hope I pronounced the last name right. Should have looked at it before we did this. He's currently undertaking a PhD in New Testament studies. He's taught apologetics, and we're going to be talking about his forthcoming dissertation on memory theory in 1 Corinthians 15. So David, thank you. How are you today?
Yeah, glad to have you. So yes, I guess you're in New York and I'm over in Perth, West Australia at 8 a.m. on Friday morning, October 1st.
Yeah, I think it's so cool because it's like you're in October and I'm still stuck in September for a few more hours. But yeah, it's super cool. So we're going to be talking about your dissertation work on 1 Corinthians 15 and memory theory and things. But before we get into that, David, you just kind of like talk a little bit about like who you are and like what you do.
Yeah, glad to have me and thanks. Yeah, so just my brief background is I grew up in Perth, West Australia, and my father was a pastor, and I studied electrical engineering and enjoyed that. But I thought I was personally interested to find out a bit more about my faith, as well as, I did have an inkling that it would be something I'd like to be more involved in as well. And so I went to Dallas Theological Seminary and did a master's of theology there about a decade ago. And after doing that, my wife and we'd gone to Dallas, so skipping a few details here. She was from Singapore and we had to return there for a while because she had a contract with the Singapore government to fulfill. So I got into a little bit of lecturing at East Asia School of Theology and taught a bit of apologetics, as well as I started a reasonable faith group there, which the first chapter was opened in Dallas while I was a student there. So it was great to be a part of that. And it was also great I think it was the first non-North American chapter that started. Not that matters anyway, and it's great to see there's lots of those around now. After that, I wasn't from Singapore and I wasn't able to secure a permanent residency there for long term. And so my family and I decided to come back to Perth, and we've been here for roughly 7 years. I've been doing the PhD for roughly 4 years, as well as doing a bit of teaching, including at Alpha Crucis College, which is the Pentecostal Bible College of Australia, as well as Sheridan College, which is a Baptist college in Perth. And do a bit of apologetics, a bit of Christian worldview. So that's brief some of my background.
That's great. Yeah. So I'm curious, before we get into all this serious stuff, which is hotter, Dallas or Australia?
Yeah, so it depends, obviously, like where, but if you're comparing Dallas to Perth, the summers are almost the same. But Dallas does get colder in winter in the sense that you do get ice, whereas it rarely gets, so I'm going to do the whole Celsius Fahrenheit thing here and be in precise conversions. But in Perth, it can get to freezing water 0, like 32, but it only happens for like a few hours on average, like at the coldest part of the morning. So in general, I would say Perth slightly warmer than Dallas, but yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well, I appreciate you answering that question on the spot, throwing these tough questions at you to start off, David. But now let's get into like your dissertation, because you have a lot of really cool work. So let's talk about like what is the heart of your argument regarding like memory theory in 1 Corinthians 15?
Yep. Yeah. So I haven't finished my dissertation yet, but hopefully I'm actually got a message from my supervisors meeting next week, and hopefully be wrapping up this semester, and hopefully pass in submission, of course. Yeah, actually, on a crazy thing for dissertations in Australia, I think because we used to be so remote and for some reason we haven't changed with the time, I don't have to give an oral defense of it. It's just a written submission. Yeah. So it's in the hands of people, and they're anonymous to me. So, just obviously for professional reasons, you don't get to know who fails you. So my dissertation's entitled Jesus' Resurrection in Early Christian Memory, the Implications of Memory Theory for Understanding Jesus' Resurrection in 1 Corinthians. So a bit happening there, but it's basically to say it's looking at how memory impacts Jesus' resurrection. And so for a dissertation, you need to narrow the scope. So it looks particularly at 1 Corinthians, because that's one of the earliest sort of detailed sources on Jesus' resurrection. Yeah.
That's super great. Yeah. Do you have anything you want to add, or do you want to dive in?
Yeah, happy to. So just more how it looks at then. So it basically begins by saying that Jesus' resurrection has been studied. There's lots of great stuff out there. I mean, there's so much to mention. As a crazy example, there is a 600-page book called A Thematic Bibliography of Jesus' Resurrection that is not like a book in terms of contents. It's just a bibliography. And it's 600 pages of listing sources, and it lists approximately 7,000 English sources on Jesus' resurrection. But yeah, just to name a few, people like N.T. Wright's The Resurrection of the Son of God, Mike Lucona's The Resurrection of Jesus, and more recently people like Bass and Loke's work on the resurrection, or Dale Allison's, have been great treatments of that. And most of them have used what you might call a criteria of authenticity approach. This is to say they've looked at what criteria can show that the sources are likely reliable, things like multiple independent attestation, embarrassment, dissimilarity. Yeah, and so a PhD needs to be something novel or new. And so I've used memory to look at Jesus' resurrection, which to date, as far as I know, hasn't been done. It's been done on other topics, like Anthony the Don studied the Son of Man sayings, and Chris Keith looked at Jesus' literacy and things like that. And there's been others. But yeah, so I'm using a memory approach to look at Jesus' resurrection.
Yeah, I think this is super cool. Did I cut you off, David?
No, yep, we're good.
Okay, awesome. No, we're good. So this is super cool, and I love this research and everything you're doing, because it's just like I'm like, memory theory. Wow, this sounds pretty intense and worth thinking about. So obviously, like, if you're familiar with like apologetics or things, I'm sure you're familiar with like the 1 Corinthians 15 creed that's talked about. So let's talk about like Paul. Like, how do Paul's memories like come into the picture, like when we're talking about this creed in 1 Corinthians?
Yeah. So in 1 Corinthians, chapter 6, verse 14 talks about how it's talking about sexual immorality and the use of the body. And it says, just as Christ has been raised, you'll be raised. And it's just sort of a single verse. But yeah, it's not till chapter 15 where it's dealt in more detail. And in there, you get the fact that Paul says in the first couple of verses, as well as verse 11 of chapter 15, that this message of Jesus' death and resurrection, the gospel, is something that Paul and the others, I think the other apostles, have already preached to them. So there's a sense in which there's memory of, I was with you in person in Corinth, which you can line up in the book of Acts and say this message was spoke, as well as you get in verses, chapter 15, verses 3 to 8, you get in verse 8, Paul's own account, his firsthand, if you like, memory experience, autobiographical recollection of what he experienced with Jesus, or the resurrected Jesus, as well as then in verses 3 to 7, you get Paul passing on the traditions, which say memories that he's got, but it's not his firsthand account of what happened to the others, such as Peter, the 12, James, the 500, and things like that. So Paul's memory of Jesus' resurrection, as recorded in 1 Corinthians, includes at least sort of 3 different things, like what happened before in person, the memory of others, as well as his own firsthand account.
Yeah, I like that. And when we're thinking about like this creed in 1 Corinthians 15, like I think one of the questions like it's always talked about is like, well, what does Paul think when he's thinking of like the resurrection of Jesus? So like some people will say like maybe that are more critical will be like, well, maybe this is some sort of like hallucination or like some sort of like private revelation. Whereas other people may say, well, no, he believed he saw like the physical risen Jesus. So when you're looking at this creed in 1 Corinthians 15, David, do you think Paul thinks that he physically saw like the risen Jesus?
Yeah, so scholars do take those variety of views. I mean, I guess you have some, one or two, and you should use the word scholar, but they may not be a New Testament scholar as such. Might even say, hey, the whole passage is an interpolation that's made up. I know Andrew Loke's book covers interacts with that sort of viewpoint, but it's not mainline scholarship. My dissertation doesn't look into it much. But yeah, in terms of what Paul thought about the resurrection, I would side with the fact that the term raised, agyro, can be understood in a few different ways, but is very likely referring to a physically body event, that Jesus was raised from being an incapacitated lying down body, raised up again to life. As well as when you continue in the passage, Paul talks about how, how can some of you say there's no resurrection? And then if that's the case, then Christ hasn't been raised. And so he seems to understand what this resurrection is, again, in sort of a bodily sense. And then there's discussion a bit about what does Paul mean by a spiritual body. And there's a lot of work been done on this, but Mike Lucona's stuff on that is one of the best. And yeah, he basically shows that the terms and how Paul uses it is not likely referring to an immaterial body, but rather spiritual body means that it's either empowered by the Spirit or that it's like the spiritual realm, in the sense that heaven is a place, a real place, but this spiritual body will be like that, like everything around it, and that. And so, yeah, how did Paul think of the resurrection? I think it's in 1 Corinthians, both the experiences that he talks about others and himself, he's likely taking that as this was a literal bodily thing that happened.
So I wonder, like, when I'm thinking about this creed in like 1 Corinthians 15, like Paul, like this creed talks about like Jesus appearing to like Cephas and then to like a group of the disciples and then like the 500, and it's like there's all these different appearances, and it seems like to me, like from my like layman's perspective, like reading this creed, like Paul kind of includes himself as like I'm like these people like saw the risen Jesus in like a physical sense, and he's like, yeah, I'm one of these people as well. Like, do you think that'd be like kind of like a fair take at what's going on here?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, I mean, historically, we would say something, we can have different reconstructions, but we'd probably say something like, the claim is that, I guess you're getting from the Gospels, that Jesus appeared to the disciples on the third day, on the Sunday morning, first a group of early women followers and to other men, and for a period of about 40 days. And then the appearance to Paul was sometime later on the road to Damascus, maybe a couple years type of thing. And then in terms of how it's phrased in 1 Corinthians 15, it's McGregor, Kirk McGregor, I think it is, has an article on this who talks about how he thinks the wording of it suggests that Paul's experience was qualitatively different from the others, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's a spiritual as opposed to that, but he's realizing like it's out of sequence, there's something different about that. And in my work on memory on that, I suggest that would tend to recall events based upon our experience. So the fact that there's a slight difference in how it's phrased in verse 8 of chapter 15 to the earlier appearances could suggest the fact that Paul's experience was on the road to Damascus, and then it was only understanding of the others that he came to realize that there was a bit of a distinction how that they're both like real appearances of bodily risen Jesus. But yeah, you even see that there.
Yeah, it's super cool. And sorry, I like had a little hiccup there when I was trying to talk. But yeah, so let's get into like this memory theory stuff, because I think this is super cool, because you talked about like this is like ground that has not yet been broken in terms of like New Testament studies, especially with regards to like this creed here in 1 Corinthians 15. So I believe you said there's like 21 like factors with regards to memory theory you consider in your dissertation regarding like this and how it impacts 1 Corinthians 15. So like, how does a memory theory approach affect your study of this creed, David?
Yeah. So yeah, I probably do cover too many factors. In fact, it is, I think I list 21, and I can't list all 21 off the top of my head. I'll have to like look at my work to remember all 21 each time. But yeah, with the memory approach, so a good book on this is Thomas Hoover Kane's The Quest for the Memory of the Historical Jesus, something close to that. And in that, here's a dissertation that he completed in 2017, and it's been a published book that came out last year that basically looks at about 7 or plus key scholars who've used memory. And he concludes that there isn't one memory approach that New Testament scholars are using. Rather, there's a diversity of ways to go about it. And in light of which, that's partly why in my dissertation, I think this is the best way to do it. And I think these are the 21 factors that are worth looking at. But basically, a memory approach is to say we're using memory to study someone's memories, and then basically say like in the Gospels or 1 Corinthians 15, in my focus is that, yeah, this is someone's memories, like Paul's memories. And so we can ask, well, what do we know about memory today? Like, what have modern studies told us? And then how can that be applied?
Yeah, that's super good.
Long. Yeah.
No, you're doing good, because I think at this point, like probably the best thing to do if you're ready is kind of dive into some of these factors, which might be super helpful. Yeah. So I love what we're going to do is we're going to go for probably like 30 more minutes or so, and then we'll save the last 15 minutes for Q&A if you have questions or super chats or things like that. But let's dive into some of these areas, because this is like, at least in my mind, like this is like the stuff that like hasn't been talked about yet. So I'm super pumped. Like, what are some of these factors in memory theory? So maybe you can just pick one that you find super interesting and you can just think about it.
Yeah. So in terms of the stuff of memories generally has been discussed, but not with respect to Jesus' resurrection. So one would be the constructive nature of memory. This is to say that not all philosophers and psychologists of memory think that memory is constructive, though I'd say the majority do nowadays. And they'd just give an example of, in studies, they would say, if we get witnesses to witness, like in a controlled environment, television, and they see like a car crash, and then you later ask them how fast was the car going when blank, and you insert the word blank with hit, smash, collided, different words, you basically find that people, if you like, remember the event differently. And you might say, oh, that's because the word suggests or contaminates stuff, and there's different factors. But the idea is that it seems that memory can be constructed based upon different factors, and they've done other similar experiments as well. And so in this case, for memory, you'd just be asking, if the claim is Jesus rose again, how could memory sort of affect that? Like, what sort of things would come into play that? And I guess in brief, I would say that the constructive extent of memory has to be consistent with the setting. So for example, if I asked you, like in your kitchen, what are some items there? You're never going to remember, well, I assume you won't, that there was like a hippopotamus, or there was, just certain items just don't fit that context. But, if you try to remember and said, I think my kitchen has like a toaster, knives, plates, like all of that's there, even though it may turn out that, that morning there was actually no plates there, but memory might construct the fact that it was, because it's consistent with that. And so I basically argue that Jesus' resurrection as a bodily event in the midst of history was not the typical afterlife viewpoint of first century Jews. They were expecting a bodily resurrection, yes, but at the end of the age, at the end of the eschaton. And so as such, this is not something that their memory would likely just make up and sort of trick them by accident. Rather, there's probably some other thing that happened that caused them to describe it that way, and why they're remembering it that way. So that's just like one factor, say the constructive nature of memory. And I'm saying
before we get into so I just wanted to kind of make sure I'm tracking this right, because I think this is super cool. It's still cool even if I'm totally misunderstanding you. But it's like when we're thinking about constructive memory, it's like I'm thinking about Paul here in First Corinthians, he's walking around persecuting the Christians. He doesn't have in his background knowledge this belief that there's going to be this Messiah in the middle of the ages that's going to rise again. This isn't in Paul's background knowledge. He's thinking that potentially there's going to be this later resurrection at the end of times. Mm-hmm. So this Jesus stuff, this isn't anything he was expecting. So when he experiences this, it would weigh some credence to the resurrection, as an actual event, because it goes against maybe him going off of maybe some assumptions he had in the background. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah. That's basically what I'm trying to say. They weren't expecting, particularly Paul then. Yeah, he wasn't expecting anyone to sort of be raised, let alone Jesus, who he wouldn't have seen as the Messiah sort of thing. Rather, he was likely accursed by God. And so, the fact that someone like him comes along to have that belief, have the memory of that Jesus was risen, just wouldn't be the kind of thing that the constructive nature of memory would accidentally make up. Just like how I might remember saying, I thought there was a toaster in my kitchen, but it turns out I must have remembered from my parents' house or a friend's house or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's super cool. Do you have anything else you want to add with regards to this constructive theory of memory, or do you want to move on to another factor?
Yeah, there's definitely more that can be said, but that's just sort of at least one aspect of how it affects it. So in terms of my dissertation, I guess most people have sort of big ambitions and stuff gets removed. So I've had a few stuff removed, one of which I would consider all the different logical possibilities for Jesus' resurrection, such as and Andrew Loke's work on this, I think, is really logical and a good way of describing it. But so, I've said, I think First Corinthians teaches the view that Paul believes Jesus rose bodily, but some people say, you've misread it. And so I still thought, it's worthwhile considering what would memory mean for the other interpretations of Jesus' resurrection. And so this includes things like the disciples didn't see anything, but they lied. The disciples saw something, but it was intermental. The disciples saw, and the third option then would be the disciples saw something, and then it was extramental, but it wasn't actually Jesus. It was mistaken identity. The fourth one would be the disciples saw something, it's extramental. It was Jesus, but he didn't actually die on the cross. He just swooned or fainted. And then, I forget what number we're up to now, but the fifth one, I think, is disciples saw something. It was extramental. It's out of their mind. It was Jesus. He really had died, but he just rose naturally from some sort of natural abnormality. And then the last option would be, I think the seventh one, that Jesus died, that the disciples saw something, it was extramental, it was Jesus, he had died and he'd been raised supernaturally. Yeah, which I think is what the Gospels and Paul teaches, that God raised Jesus. That's the explanation they give. And sorry, the point I'm bringing that up is to say that also it's worth considering what would memory mean for these other explanations. So if you say memory is constructive, like how would that affect the idea that disciples lied, hallucinated, and stuff like that? And by and large, there's several theories there. So I think the objective visions theory actually fares similar to the resurrection hypothesis. And I almost need to define that because there's different ways people define an objective vision. But I take this to be similar to visions like the prophets had, like Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, where it's not just a subjective vision they made up. This is rather God acting on them to give them a vision of the prophecy or something. And so I'm saying if God gave an objective vision to the disciples or Paul, then the memory of that would be similar, although I actually think it would be still stronger for a real event. But for all the other viewpoints, I actually think memory makes it less probable. It's like constructive nature of memory to your lying, for instance, is likely to ravage havoc. If you've told other lies, it's likely you could confuse that. Unlike a bodily resurrection is a unique thing that's not likely to get confused with other memories because it's just not something that happens. You don't see resurrections every day. Yeah, unfortunately, lying for most of us is more than once in a lifetime event and things like that. So I think these other views of Jesus' resurrection, memory tends to do more damage. It makes them less likely.
Mm-hmm. So when you're talking about like memory theory and like these different ones in your dissertation, are these like different ideas on like how memory works, and you're kind of looking at like how the resurrection fares with each one, or like what's going on here with like all these different theories of memory?
Yeah, I guess basically, yeah. So I would say if you go pick up any uni textbook on memory or philosophy, you say like, what do they tell us about memory? And so they normally will have several factors, and there's stuff that isn't relevant to the Gospels accounts of Jesus' resurrection, and that may include like childhood memory or like amnesia and like Alzheimer's and stuff like that. But otherwise, there's a whole bunch of stuff they're going to teach you about memory. They're going to say there's different types of memories. Memories decay at a certain rate. People forget things. Memory can be affected by suggestibility when people say something like, now I've talked a bit about being hippos in kitchens. I don't know why, but that may just suggest random things and it just implants there. And so, yeah, I'm just saying there's like 20 plus factors that these standard textbooks will have. And so I'm just trying to look at them one by one and say, how would that affect that? Like, what would we know? And I could comment there. So I'm not sure why. Sometimes makes me worry if I've like used something wrongly. But there's only one or two other people who have looked at the philosophy of memory in New Testament studies. And so to me, that was just like a gaping hole that was like, great, I'll look at this. And there's lots of really good things there. For instance, you did say how the different theories of memory. There's literally in the philosophy of memory 4 theories of remembering, of what it is to remember something. There's the epistemic theory, the causal theory, the simulational theory, and great, I just forgot one. But and so with each of them, I basically just look at and say, these are what philosophers of memory have said about how memory may work. And then, what would that mean for those?
So this part that like you've been talking about, like comparing like memory theory in like 1 Corinthians 15, like, so you're looking at like these different hypotheses about like, well, what did the disciples experience? Like, did they lie? Did they like see the risen Jesus? Was it like a hallucination? And you're like looking at these ideas and like in light of memory theory and saying, well, like at least like when we're looking at like these different ideas with regards to memory theory, like potentially like the resurrection is like the best game in town to like explain like where these memories come from.
Yeah, that's right. That's that being said, sorry, I do think on this topic it's something we should consider, but my dissertation itself has all the other views removed, so it only talks about exegesis of 1 Corinthians 15, which concludes that it was a bodily God raised Jesus event, and so it looks at what memory means for that. But yeah, I do think just as we're discussing this and people of interest in general would be how does a memory affect the case of Jesus' resurrection generally. And so you're going to want to ask, what does memory mean for those different theories as well? And I did actually consider them, but just got took out of the final cut.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I'd be curious to talk about then maybe like the hallucination hypothesis, because I think a lot of people,
Yep.
at least like, I mean, I don't run laps around like resurrection scholarship or anything like that. Like I'm not, but like a lot of people gravitate towards some sort of like hallucination idea, where like well, maybe like Peter had some like brief hallucination, or like Paul, like, and there's these few hallucinations, and that maybe that could explain like the facts or whatever that you need to explain like the growth of Christianity and whatnot. So in your mind, like in your opinion, then David, like where does this fall short with regards to like memory theory compared to like a resurrection hypothesis?
Yeah, got you. And I do think that's probably one of the more popular naturalistic theories out there. So yeah, it's definitely worth being aware of. And I guess in regards to why does it fall short, is it partly depends what you're comparing it to. But so if we're saying another view is that God raised Jesus, and yeah, we're saying how many other times have there been resurrections? And you may actually say none, but depending on how you define resurrection, there has been other resuscitations in the New Testament. For instance, the Jairus' daughter, the saints in Matthew 27, and that. So you could say that these other resurrections could have been confused or a source of contamination of Jesus' resurrection. But just in brief, you'd probably say it's likely a unique event, not likely to be confused. So with studies on hallucinations, basically you find that they're not all that uncommon and that people do have them, and such that and defining hallucination can basically be any sort of false sense that didn't actually happen. So I mean, the most common one would be, if you ever thought, oh, my phone just vibrated, I got a message, you look at your phone and you're like, oh, there's nothing there. So that's technically like defined as that'd be a hallucination. But and so in the case of Jesus' resurrection, you could be saying hallucination hypothesis could be that they thought they heard a voice, but when they turned around, it wasn't there, or they thought they saw something. Of course, the gospel accounts have Jesus' resurrection appearances occurring in multiple modes of senses, like they both see, hear, touch, and stuff like that, which hallucinations like that do happen, but they're rarer. But anyway, the point would be is that hallucinations are not all that uncommon, such that in general, then someone who has experienced them could, in theory, have had other experiences and accounts, and then so it is more possible that they might confuse one or the other. And what I'm getting at in this one particular instance is that would mean that it's more likely that it is a memory that could be confused with others, which just means it is a memory that probably didn't get as likely deeply embedded and ingrained as a unique event. An illustration, I guess, for this is like, it's very sad. We're remembering 20 years of September 11th. And just even in my life, I'm 37, and that's just one of the most shocking things. Even, I'm 12 hours time zone around the world. So I guess I had a different experience of the event. It wasn't morning for me. Mm-hmm. But that still just sort of stands out. But other things in my life that may be more common, like it's hard to remember. And so the idea here would be as well, if people are having more common hallucinations, it's less likely to have made that deep memory impression on them as well. It's less likely to affect their identity the way that a one-off event like a bodily resurrection would, as opposed to hallucination of it.
Yeah, so I think what you're trying to say then, David, just make sure on the same page, because this is super cool, is thinking about like something like a really massive event, say like a resurrection of Jesus. That's going to make a major impact on like someone's memory and like how they're going to like orient their lives. Whereas if it's just like, say, like a hallucination, like it's not as likely that they're going to have this like big massive transformation based upon like a hallucination.
Yeah, well said. Yeah.
Awesome, I appreciate that. Did you want to add something?
No, that's
okay.
Good.
Yeah, that's good. So maybe you want to talk about like another factor with memory theory or something, wherever you want to take this, that you think might be the best to explore.
Yeah, got you. Just trying to pick which one of us, and this is probably the most boring of the one, but I think when people do think of memory, they think about forgetting, and so what's known as transience, in that sense, basically forgetting. I mean, that's obviously a straightforward factor to look at. Yeah. And that's basically to say, if we were trying to recount like what we did yesterday, or what we had for breakfast yesterday, it's easy to do now, 24. So I guess, sorry, only 12 hours for you. But shorter after the period was if a week later you're like, oh, what did I have for breakfast like a week ago, it's harder, or, a year ago. And obviously, if it turns out like yesterday was your birthday, then you may be like, that was a significant birthday that may affect it. But so transience in general, it's going to say the further away from event is, the more likely you're going to forget it. And that's one of the advantages of the 1 Corinthians text, namely that it's one of the earliest texts we have. And so depending on how it's dated, you're talking about a couple decades, yet the creed, which you've already mentioned, 1 Corinthians, is something that Paul received and he passed on. And then, so he already told them, so such that if you like, the memory of it goes back to, a few years before 1 Corinthians, because he visited them. Yeah, and you could ask, like, when did he receive this? And there's no real universal consensus on anything, but on this date either. So within 2 decades is what we'd know. And I think Dale Allison's book, which came out earlier this year, sort of goes with that route. But the vast majority of scholars would say within a decade, and some, like I think it's James Dunn, says within 18 months. So you've got this very close to the event. That's to say, though, it still has to be remembered for another, if you put 18 months, it still has to be remembered for another sort of 18 years before it gets written down in 1 Corinthians. But in general, that's pretty close. And we couldn't remember what we had for breakfast 18 years ago, but this is just not like breakfast. This is like a life-changing event that you'd have to look at other factors, one of which is called flashbulb memory and like personal event memory, which is things like September 11th or other significant events. But yeah, in terms of just transients, you would say that actually this fares pretty well. And I guess because it's saying other documents, like even if you take the Gospel of Mark as conservative dating, are more likely 3 decades. So that's in a sense a bit worse off, or like other Gospels and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. So this is super. I don't know why you call this boring, David, because I think this is super cool. Thinking about like forgetting, like so, like the idea is like we have this idea of like this creed keeps passing along. Like it's not like someone like they all just forgot the creed, which means like, well, maybe there's something like super significant that kind of happened like behind this creed in 1 Corinthians 15.
Yep. Yeah. Got you. So, and just a few things there, like you mentioned, it's not just, I guess, Paul's memory then. We're saying it's a memory of community and it would have been passed on. So it's not like Bart Ehrman in his book, Jesus Before the Gospels, is a bit on memory and orality. And he would use the telephone game of people sort of whispering things on to show how like unreliable it can be. But definitely other scholars, one of which I can think of recently would be Craig Keener's Christo biography. Talks about how it's more like a web. It's like a net, not a chain that's passed down, but like, it's sort of whole growing out. And so there's no one weak link in the chain. Rather, there's all the apostles, other disciples, Christians going around the place telling these sort of stories. So it'd be likely preserved.
That's super interesting. Do you have another kind of facet you want to talk about here? We have like 10 more minutes and then we'll do a little bit of Q&A.
Yep. Even, I guess, so still staying on forgetting then. So transience is one aspect of that, but you can look at how things are forgotten as well. And like one is, I guess transience space, what you might call decay. It decays over time. But another one could be interference, which is to say, if I ask you to remember the number 7, and then I start saying like 8, 9, 6, and then we talk about other stuff and do this. All this stuff has interfered and distracted you from what that number was, although hopefully you can still remember 7. It was a pretty easy illustration. But the idea would be if there's other similar events, like, if there are lots of people who are getting resuscitated, like maybe the disciples confused Jesus' resurrection with Lazarus or something like that. But ideas would say there really wasn't that many things to interfere. This was a pretty unique event at that particular time. And so it's not likely that Jesus' resurrection got forgotten due to interference. Just like with decay, with transience, it's not that far off. So it's not likely either. There's also, I guess, retrieval theories of forgetting to say that we don't have the cue to help us retrieve it. This can happen in real life with you meet a friend who you always see at uni, and like, I guess maybe at the uni, I'm trying to think what you were in New York nowadays.
University.
Yeah. Australians tend to be a little bit more casual than Americans.
I like Australian language better than American English, just saying. So, and it sounds cooler. So,
Yep. Yeah, thanks. But so let's just say you meet a friend and you're used to seeing them dressed a certain way, but now you see them, maybe they've just come from work and they're wearing weird clothes, and you're like, oh, I recognize you, but because there's something different about them, or like they've had a haircut, you're not able to retrieve like who it is and make the connection. And so you could say the same thing about Jesus' resurrection. Would there be some sort of retrieval clues that make it distracted, less likely that disciples remember it? And I guess once again, because I think it's likely a unique event, a bodily resurrection in the midst of history, yeah, there's not likely to be things here that got confused with that retrieval memory of it. So they would likely be able to retrieve it all right, and it should be accurate in that one regard, and you have to consider other factors.
Okay, yeah, that's super cool. Maybe you have like one, probably like one more factor, or maybe two, that you find super interesting. I mean, I'm sure you find all 21 super interesting, but like one that you think, like for the sake of this discussion, that might be worth talking about with regards to 1 Corinthians 15.
Yep. Yeah, and that being said, not all 21 are equally interesting. For instance, you can look at the effects of memory and age, and you basically ask how old was Paul when Jesus appeared to him? How old was he when he told the memory? And the basic thing is that children, as well as older, and kind of say this like nicely, but yeah, older elderly people have, generally speaking, more difficulty with memory. But in that sort of the vast middle period, people don't have as much issue. And I'd say there's no reason. The general, well, maybe not the general view, but the general paintings showed the disciples being quite old when they were with Jesus. But several scholars, like one, which is Graieg again, would say that the disciples were likely in the late teens. And maybe Peter, because he's said to be married, was just like early 20s. But when they were life and ministry with Jesus, and then if you say 20 years later, and then Paul's actually probably just a little bit younger than Jesus, but a similar sort of age to some of the other disciples. You're saying if they received it then at like 20, and then now Paul's right down in his 40, like based on his age, there's no reason to think that would be a unreliable factor. But yeah, that's a pretty boring factor. The same, you can look at health and memory and say like, yeah, people in good health, good diets and stuff like this remember things better. So what do we know about first century diets and Paul's health and treatment? And that one's a bit tricky. I actually choose to say here that it's probably best just to remain agnostic in the sense of not making a strong opinion either way, because for instance, he was whipped, beaten, shipwrecked and stuff like that. But he also was traveling around speaking and teaching, so we've got no reason to think he had a bad memory based upon his health either. But so those were probably not so interesting points. So maybe one other interesting one would be what's known as personal event memory, or like flashbulb memory. And this is basically to say that some memories are more vivid and resistant to transience than others, that certain events in our life, such as September 11th, yeah, and obviously depends how old you are. I'll take it for example. Were you born? Yeah,
I was like 1 year old, so I have no memories of 9/11.
Yeah, totally understood that. But yeah, but there would still be, I think, certain things in your life, like maybe high school graduation. Yeah, in people's weddings and stuff like this, or sadly, if people have traumatic experiences as well, that can become sort of flashbulb memories for them. And these would be things that are more likely well remembered. And so the question is, would Jesus' resurrection be a flashbulb memory? And if you thought it was a bodily event, a real event, which I do, and several other scholars do, then you'd say, yeah, that's very likely generated a flashbulb memory. The experience of the disciples having followed Jesus for 3+ years, and then it seemed to turn out that they were hoping he was going to be the Messiah, the Christ, but he got crucified by the Romans. It seemed like he was a fraud, that they've wasted sort of their time and lives. And then God raises him from the dead would, just be huge and would create like a flashbulb memory. But yeah, if you compared it to some of the other views and said, the disciples just lied, a lie is not going to have that same embeddedness. And actually at my kids' school, they've got a poster up that says, and it's a bit simplistic, but it's a kid's poster, so give them a break. It says, if you tell the truth, you don't have to remember. And the idea being for kids is saying, if you make up the lie, you got to remember your story as well. But if you just tell the truth, you can just say it as it is. And so, yeah, in that regard, for like flashbulb memory, lying isn't like to create that. And so that sort of view is likely to suffer more. And the same you could ask about, hallucination or swooning, like how likely is that to impact that. And for instance, just on the swoon theory, the fact that Jesus, if you assume that Jesus fainted and swooned on the cross, like the fact that the disciples see him alive after that he's regained consciousness would actually create a flashbulb memory, but not so much of his resurrection, but the fact that he hasn't died. Like it wouldn't inspire them to say Jesus is risen, but it would inspire them to go like, that's amazing. Like how many people live crucifixion? But yeah, so I was just saying there's different aspects and how it affect the different theories. And yeah, flashbulb memory is just likely to apply for Jesus' resurrection as saying it was a significant event, and they would likely be able to recall even some of the details about it.
Yeah, that's super cool. So what I'd like to ask you, David, and then we'll go to Q&A in just a moment here. So we'll get through as many as we can. And then if there's any super chats, obviously we'll take those first. So like in sum, David, like when you look at like memory theory in 1 Corinthians 15, like where does this in your mind like leave us in terms of like making a case for like the resurrection of Jesus?
Yeah. So in theory, I'd say this is the first major study to look at it. That's to say there's definitely been other things. So you don't always want to like pretend and try to blow up your trumpet too much. For instance, James Dunn's book, Jesus Remembered, covers the whole of Jesus' life, but does look at Jesus' resurrection. He generally looked at orality. There's been others like Dale Allison's book this year that uses a bit of memory as well. But yeah, by and large, though, I would say that memory approach hasn't been used for Jesus' resurrection much. And so it's interesting to be able to see what that sort of case would say for it. And I think the view that if you interpret the scriptures, and right now I'm not just thinking of 1 Corinthians 15, but the whole scriptures to think that Jesus raised God from the dead. If that had happened, then I think the disciples would remember it really well. I personally do think that happened, but I'm not saying that you can demonstrate and prove that. But in terms of memory, we're saying if that had happened, it's very likely that the disciples would have remembered that event very well. Whereas if you contrast that with other things, like if nothing had happened and the disciples just lied, or if they had experienced hallucination or swoon or something, that's not likely to have made as long-lasting memory. And it doesn't seem to be consistent then with like how it's described in New Testament literature. For instance, like in 1 Corinthians 15 again, Paul says to them in about verse 3 that what he received, I passed on to them as of first importance. And this is to say that it wasn't a secondary thing, like it's crucial. Yeah, and it's not likely to have had that central position on the other views. But with memory of a bodily resurrection, it's likely to have been really vivid, long-lasting, made a deep impression. And so, yeah, memory theory supports the idea that Jesus could have been risen and it could have been remembered rightly by the apostles. I sort of steal from, I think in the last 4 years, Finding Dory came out. Mm-hmm. And so I was watching that with my kids. And over the credits, it has the song Unforgettable, which is not written by Disney Pixar. It's like an old song, but, they just sing it there. Yeah. And that occurred to me, you could use that same sort of logic with Jesus' resurrection. You could say that for the disciples, like Jesus' resurrection would have been unforgettable. It'd be something that experience for them that would have just been sort of burnt in their memories. And that's what we sort of see, that they become a resurrection community that goes about talking about it all over the place.
I think, David, if you ever put your dissertation into a book, that'd be a pretty cool ending for a book to talk about that little like story with Finding Dory and whatnot. So just saying. I better get credit if you ever do that. Just saying. But we'll go to a few questions now for about 10 minutes. So the question from Lucas, let's put this one first. It says, does David think the criteria of embarrassment is compatible with the recent developments in social memory theory and the Gospels?
Yep. So there hasn't been a huge amount of stuff that I'm aware of that's tried to combine memory and the criteria of embarrassment or any of the criteria of authenticity. So yeah, I only have a random footnote that says I think they can go together. I'm trying to think. So yeah, it's generally been treated as like an either or. And so on the whole, my dissertation, the project was just to see, well, what does memory say? And I personally do think that you could, in addition, then use the criteria of authenticity, and in a sense, you'd be able to say more. But you're putting that aside with this question as well. So it just points out about social memory. So that was also like one of the 21 factors that I looked at. And so some of the New Testament scholars only look at social memory. And an example, again, I guess if we go with September 11th, no, well, there are very few like, what do you call it, like conspiracy theory type levels that say September 11th never happened. But by and large, like the remembrance of that event is not asking, did it happen? And that's basically because it's taken as a given. It did happen, and this is how society has remembered it. This is the communal memory. This is how it's affected us. This is how it's changed us. Like we were united as a nation. We stand up bravery and courage. We're not going to be terrorized and stuff like this. And so that's like how social memory would affect it. I feel with Jesus' resurrection, both questions are relevant. Namely, we want to ask, did the memory, did it actually happen? So just like in most courts and testimonies, they're asking, like, did this actually happen? Has the witness recalled the memory accurately and rightly? So I think all those sort of criteria are important and come in. And sorry, criteria, I don't mean criteria of embarrassment or authenticity here, but the kind of criteria that someone would use in a court of law, and I don't want to use necessarily the legal standard on the Gospels, but for memory, that they're going to be relevant to assessing whether the memory happened. As well as then for Jesus' resurrection, we want to ask, what is the social memory of that? And that's to say, it's got these impacts on the community, how they identify and that. But I'm sorry, that was just like some thoughts. But the question, if you want, how does the criteria of embarrassment is compatible with recent developments in social memory theory and the Gospels? So I would say that I probably missed it. There's just a lot of stuff out there, but I haven't seen anyone arguing that case yet. But yeah, I personally do think they can go together. And I think it would be done something like this. You would say, if a memory is embarrassing, it's less likely that a memory has been made up. And so that can go together with memory. And I guess depending on what you mean by social memory here, in the sense that a social memory can be both one that's held by society or one that has impact and value for society as well. But yeah, as opposed to, you're going to contrast social memory with individual memory, and the individual memory is going to be those factors on how individuals remember particular stuff. But yeah, that's a few thoughts there.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. We have a question here from True Counterphobia, which says, in a book I'm writing called I talk about human freedom, and I tie this to memory. Sensory memory, shallow processing, and schema is what I'm using. I say we are free when we challenge our schema. And to clarify, he says, I'm saying that when we experience something new that contradicts our schema with our shallow processing, we have to make a decision based on its truthfulness. We decide on information. So I have no idea what's going on here. It's way over my head, but I don't know if you know what's going on, David.
Yeah, and so that was, sorry, I don't know if you're able to get the full question just in front of me so I can see both parts of that.
I can't do both at the same time, but I can go back and forth. So just tell me when you switch.
Yeah, no worries. Because, yeah, it's also quite big. But, yeah, those are some of the factors as well. Like, yeah, to say schema would be what's the typical sort of grid, the framework that people remember things on. And I can't give a good illustration right now, but I guess I feel like I went with the kitchen. If you go with that, there's certain schema of how kitchens are set up and laid out and objects in there as well. So for Jesus' resurrection, we wanted to be asking what's the typical way that death and the afterlife beliefs are understood. And I would argue that bodily resurrection in the midst of history sort of breaks that schema. I mean, some parts of it fit, like that the Jews were expecting a bodily resurrection, but at the end of the age, yep. But sorry, more to this specific question then. Yeah, so there's just like several parts there, but yeah, in terms of shallow processing, yeah, we do want to think stuff whether it makes a deep memory impression or it's shallow. And I guess I was suggesting with the flashbulb memory stuff that Jesus' resurrection, if it was a bodily event, would make a deep impression as opposed to a shallow one. I think we would be made by a lie or something like that. So you would go to the second part of the question again. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, so I feel like to answer this clear, I need to just have the question rephrased. But I mean, I do think that that's good. Like these are some of the factors that, that need to be thought about, and they will have implications for how different interpretations of Jesus' resurrection. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you for that, David. We have another question here from Lucas that says, does David think that a particular Old Testament passage in mind, in say 1 Corinthians 15, when it says that according to the scriptures, or does he favor Wright's view that the story of Israel as a whole?
Yeah. Yeah, partly I guess the teachers have influenced me. I often don't like to be too committal and say like this is the strongest view, but rather I say, look, if this was the case, then this follows. If this was the case, then that follows. So yeah, on like this, yeah, I do spend, I don't know, several pages discussing on what does it mean by according to the scriptures, what scriptures they have in mind. Yeah, and you do have those different views where they might be thinking they refer to specific passages, such as, oh man, like in Hosea it talks about like, yeah, on raised on the third day. Yeah, or could it be, particularly if you look in the book of Acts, like when they talk about Jesus' resurrection, they'll often say, like, David was dead and buried, his body's still with us, but, Christ has been raised up. And so it could be saying that those specific scriptures, yeah, or N.T. Wright and several other scholars tend to take the view here. It's saying how Christ's resurrection is fulfillment of the whole sort of thrust of scripture, that, yeah, it's not pointing to one individual. But yeah, and so I would tend to not be taking a strong view on either way, but saying there's both these sort of views. And in regards to memory, like you would have particular keys to link you to specific passages, like that's the cue, like how you would associate them and that. And yeah, as well if it's sort of the whole of scripture, then this is showing how central it would be and how much it will affect the identity, in the sense that it's not just one thing, but it's like this is the whole thrust of it. This is what it mean. And one of the things I try to do a bit in in my dissertation is to point out how it's not just memory is in verses 3 to 8 where Paul has the creed. Memory affects how he understands the resurrection body, like in verses 35 to 58. When he talks about what the resurrection body would be like as well, it's informed by his memory of Jesus' resurrection, as well as say in chapter 6, verse 14, when he says that just as God raised Jesus, he raised us, and he's talking about sexual immorality and use of our body and stuff like this. Memory of Jesus' resurrection informs how he thinks about how we should do our ethics, like how we should behave and have our body as well. So in that sense of according to scripture, in that broad sense, it can show how it's impacting how he thinks about life in general. Like Jesus' resurrection meets all of this in scripture, and it impacts not just what we say about Jesus' death, but it impacts our eschatology, it impacts our ethics and stuff like that. It's like a core memory of, if you want, so going with Disney, what's the other memory movie with we got sadness, joy, and yeah.
I have no idea.
Yeah, but they have like core memories in the character's life as well. So saying Jesus' resurrection would be like a core memory that can impact that. But yeah, sorry. So in direct answer to this question, I'm not too committal as to which is the better one. And I would say there's scholars who argue both quite well. I guess if I was to argue, I'd probably go, I think, towards that right view that it's not one in mind, but at least several, and yeah, perhaps the whole trajectory of scripture. Yeah.
Yeah, well, David, this was such a fun interview. Like, there's so many cool things to talk about here and so much to explore. Really like blazing the trail. I was in a class today that was talking about like westward expansion for the USA, and I'm like, this is like westward expansion, but for like New Testament studies, with like memory theory and stuff. So do you have any kind of like last thoughts, things you didn't get to say? And then feel free to like share like how people can like connect with you or follow you or anything like that.
Yeah, no worries. So I think I've been a little over the place there with things, but yeah, I would say that, yeah, memory, I think, does have some usefulness for study. I don't think it's like the one way forward, but like, yeah, I think in that sense, the criteria of authenticity still stand. And so people continue to use that. So if you use memory as well, it may have more to add, but without it, it's not like you've done bad studies. But what I've looked at it doesn't sort of hurt the case for Jesus' resurrection. In fact, because I think there's good reason to think that the disciples could have remembered a bodily resurrection event, compared to the other theories. I actually think they tend to get weakened. So in some sense, it actually strengthens the case for Jesus' resurrection. Yeah, in terms of following me, I haven't really produced much stuff. In fact, this has been my first interview online. So yeah, thank you as well.
Yeah.
But I have started a ministry that I haven't got going, but because I had this coming up, I was like, oh, I better get some things going. So the ministry is called Why Christianity, and the website's whychristianity.org.au. And right now it's basically just like a blank page about what we believe and the kind of things we hope to do. So hopefully we'll actually get around to producing some content. I guess I've been focused more my PhD. But there's so many great ministries out there, such as your own, which I think people go do and find, much better resources to continue. Hopefully I'll get something done eventually.
Well, I mean, you are kind of like undertaking a PhD and like have a family. So I do understand, you might have a little bit on your plate. So yeah, I appreciate you so much for coming on today, David. It's been so much fun to talk with you. This is so much great stuff. And I'm hoping that you get to share your work out more because there's so much great stuff here to think about. And I think it was Lucas who was in the chat that recommended me to interview you. So big thanks to Lucas. This is super interesting to me. And I think this is so much fun. So yeah, thank you, David, one last time for coming on. It's been so much fun. Appreciate you a lot.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And it's great to see all your work. So,
yeah. And thank you to Lucas and True Counterphobia and Pseudonym and everyone else who joined. Wish you guys the best. If you found this edifying and you aren't subscribed, I encourage you to subscribe, leave a like, all that fun stuff. And if you join the channel, you can become a patron at patreon.com/Adherent For as little as $1 a month. Your support means a lot. But yeah, David, one final time. Thank you so much. It's been so much fun.
Yeah, thanks as well.
And thank you, everyone. Yes, God bless.